What happens when a man running from his past meets a woman who can see his future? In the dusty corners of Arizona, where ancient wisdom meets modern desperation, sometimes the most unexpected encounters change everything. This is the true story of how one conversation with a stranger at a roadside diner didn't just alter the course of one man's life, it saved it. Some say the Apache people have always possessed a unique connection to time itself, seeing beyond the present moment into the threads that weave tomorrow. Whether you believe in such things or not, what happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about fate, second chances, and the mysterious ways people enter our lives exactly when we need them most. This is not a story about magic. This is a story about hope finding you when you've stopped looking for it. Marcus Chen had been driving for 3 days straight, surviving on gas station coffee and the kind of regret that sits heavy in your chest like swallowed stones. The divorce papers were crumpled in the passenger seat next to empty energy drink cans and a phone that hadn't stopped buzzing with calls from his lawyer, his ex-wife, and the bank. He'd stopped answering after Phoenix. The small Arizona town of Cedar Ridge appeared like a mirage through his dusty windshield. Population 847, according to a sun-faded sign that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Marcus pulled his beat-up Honda into the parking lot of Martha's Diner, a building that seemed to be held together by determination and desert wind. His hands shook as he turned off the engine, and he couldn't tell if it was from too much caffeine or the complete collapse of his life back in Seattle. Inside the diner, time moved differently. The clock on the wall showed 3:47 p.m., but it felt like the kind of place where afternoon could stretch into evening without anyone noticing. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with something that reminded Marcus of his grandmother's kitchen. He slid into a corner booth, grateful for the cool air conditioning against his sunburned neck. The waitress who approached him moved with quiet confidence, her silver hair braided down her back and turquoise jewelry catching the light from the window. She appeared to be in her 60s, with hands that spoke of a life spent working and eyes that seemed to see more than most people's. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for the pot she carried. Marcus nodded, studying the laminated menu without really seeing the words. Everything felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life through thick glass. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful software engineer with a house in the suburbs, a wife who laughed at his jokes, and plans for the future. Now he was a soon-to-be divorced man with $17 in his wallet and no idea where he was going. "You look like someone who's running from something," the waitress said, filling his cup with coffee that smelled like it had been made with actual care. Marcus glanced up, startled by her directness. "Is it that obvious?" She smiled, the kind of expression that held both kindness and knowing. "I'm Elena. I've worked in this place for 23 years. You see all kinds of people when you're standing behind a coffee pot, and most of them fall into two categories, those running toward something and those running from something. You've got the look of someone who's been running from for a while now." There was something about her voice that made Marcus want to tell the truth, which surprised him. He'd spent the last 6 months lying to everyone, including himself. Lying about how bad things had gotten, lying about the gambling, lying about the nights he'd spent staring at the ceiling calculating how much money he'd lost and how many years it would take to earn it back. "My life fell apart," he said simply, then immediately felt foolish for admitting it to a stranger. Elena nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world to confess over coffee. "What kind of falling apart are we talking about? The kind where you rebuild from the pieces, or the kind where you start completely over?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I lost everything. My marriage, my house, my savings. I made some bad decisions, and they kept getting worse until there was nothing left to lose." "Gambling?" Elena asked without judgment, the way someone might ask about the weather. Marcus's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "How did you know that?" "My brother went through the same thing 15 years ago. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from gambling losses. It's different from other kinds of broke. It sits in your shoulders differently." She was right, Marcus realized. He carried the weight of his losses physically, his shoulders constantly tight from the tension of calculating odds and measuring risks that had all gone wrong. He'd been so focused on the next bet, the next chance to win back what he'd lost, that he'd forgotten how to sit without planning his next move. The thing about gambling, Elena continued, settling into the booth across from him without invitation, is that it's never really about the money. It's about trying to control something when everything else feels out of control. Marcus stared at her, unsettled by how accurately she'd described the feeling he'd never been able to put into words. Are you some kind of therapist? Elena laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. No, just someone who's lived long enough to recognize patterns. My people, the Apache, we've always believed that sometimes the universe puts people in your path when you need them most. Maybe that's why you stopped here instead of driving straight through town. I stopped because I needed gas and coffee, Marcus said, but even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure it was true. He'd passed 3 other gas stations in the last hour, all of them with working pumps and signs advertising fresh coffee. Maybe, Elena said with a smile that suggested she knew something he didn't. But, you're here now, and that's what matters. You know what I see when I look at you? Marcus shook his head, not sure he wanted to know. I see someone who's been so focused on looking backward at what he's lost that he's forgotten how to look forward at what he might find. The words hit harder than Marcus expected. He'd spent months replaying every bad decision, every moment when he should have stopped, every sign he'd ignored. The weight of regret had become so familiar that he'd forgotten it wasn't permanent. It's not that simple, he said. I hurt people. My ex-wife, my parents, my business partners. I destroyed trust that took years to build. Trust can be rebuilt, Elena said. But, not if you spend all your time hiding from the people you hurt. And, definitely not if you keep running. She stood up, refilling his coffee cup without asking. You know what my grandmother used to tell me? She said that sometimes a person has to get completely lost before they can find their real path. Maybe getting lost was necessary for you. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. I don't even know where to start. Well, Elena said, checking her watch, my shift ends in an hour. If you're not in a hurry to get wherever you're going, there's someone I think you should meet. Something in her tone made Marcus pay attention in a way he hadn't in months. Who? My Aunt Mary. She's 94 years old, and she's got a way of seeing things that might surprise you. She lives about 10 minutes outside town, and she's been asking me to bring someone by to help her with a project. Someone who understands computers and technology. Marcus almost laughed. Lady, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not exactly in a position to help anyone right now. I can barely help myself. Elena's expression grew serious. Maybe helping someone else is exactly what you need to help yourself. Besides, Mary's not just anyone. She's lived through more loss and comeback than most people see in 3 lifetimes. If anyone understands starting over, it's her. The rational part of Marcus's brain told him to thank Elena for the coffee, pay his bill, and get back on the road. He had nowhere specific to go, but staying in one place felt dangerous, like giving his problems time to catch up with him. But there was something about Elena's confidence, the certainty in her voice when she talked about her aunt, that made him curious despite himself. And if he was being honest, the idea of having something to do, some purpose however small, felt better than another night in a motel room staring at the ceiling. What kind of project? He asked. Elena's smile returned, warmer than before. She's been collecting stories from the reservation for the past 5 years, interviewing elders and recording their memories. She's got boxes of tapes and notes, but she needs help getting everything organized digitally. She wants to create something that her grandchildren and their grandchildren can access. It was the kind of project Marcus would have enjoyed in his previous life, when he had the luxury of choosing work that felt meaningful. Technology with purpose, helping preserve something important rather than just building another app or system that would be obsolete in 5 years. I don't have a laptop with me, he said, which wasn't exactly saying no. Mary's got everything you'd need. Her grandson set up a computer system for her last Christmas, but she hasn't been able to figure out how to use it effectively. Marcus found himself nodding before he'd made a conscious decision. Maybe it was Elena's confidence, or maybe it was the way the afternoon light was slanting through the diner windows, making everything feel slightly magical. Or maybe it was simply that he had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. "Okay," he said. "I'll meet your aunt." Elena's face lit up with satisfaction, as if she'd known all along that he would agree. "Finish your coffee," she said. "I'll get us some food to take with us." Mary always cooks for an army, but she appreciates it when people bring something to contribute. As Elena walked toward the kitchen, Marcus sat alone in the booth, watching the small town move at its unhurried pace outside the window. A part of him still wanted to leave, to get back in his car and keep driving until he found a place where no one knew his name or his failures. But another part of him, a part that had been quiet for months, was curious about what would happen next. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to calculate the odds or predict the outcome. He was just willing to see what came next. When Elena returned with a bag of sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, she paused at the table. "You know," she said, "Mary told me yesterday that she had a feeling someone important was going to come by this week. She's been preparing for days." Marcus looked up at her, searching her face for signs that she was making this up to make him feel better. But Elena's expression was completely sincere. "She said that?" he asked. "She did. My aunt has always had a gift for sensing things before they happen. It used to drive my mother crazy when we were kids, but Mary's predictions have a way of coming true." As they walked toward the door, Marcus caught his reflection in the diner's window. He looked tired and defeated, his hair uncombed and his clothes wrinkled from days of sleeping in his car. But there was something different in his eyes, a spark of curiosity that hadn't been there when he'd walked in. Maybe Elena was right. Maybe getting lost had been necessary. And maybe, just maybe, he was about to find something he didn't even know he'd been looking for. Elena's truck kicked up dust clouds as they drove down a dirt road that seemed to stretch endlessly toward distant mesas. Marcus gripped the door handle as they bounced over ruts and rocks, wondering if he'd made a mistake agreeing to this impromptu visit. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh way, all red earth and scrubby vegetation under a sky so white it made him feel insignificant. "Mary's house is just around this bend," Elena said, downshifting as they climbed a small hill. "Fair warning, she's going to ask you a lot of questions. She's curious about people, always has been." The house that came into view was modest but well-maintained, a single-story adobe structure with a wraparound porch and flower boxes bursting with desert blooms. Solar panels glinted on the roof, and Marcus could see a satellite dish partially hidden behind a stand of cottonwood trees. It was the kind of place that looked like it had grown from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. An elderly woman emerged from the house before Elena had even parked the truck. She moved slowly but purposefully, using a carved wooden cane and wearing a flowing skirt decorated with traditional patterns. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her face was mapped with lines that spoke of decades spent smiling and squinting into the desert sun. "Aunt Mary," Elena called, climbing out of the truck. "This is Marcus, the one I told you about." Mary approached Marcus with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She was smaller than he'd expected, barely reaching his shoulder, but there was an intensity to her presence that made her seem larger than her physical size. "Marcus," she said, extending a weathered hand. "You've had a long journey." It wasn't a question, and Marcus found himself nodding before he could think about how she might know that. Her handshake was firm, and her eyes held his with the kind of direct gaze that most people found uncomfortable. But Marcus discovered he didn't want to look away. "Elena mentioned you might need help with a computer project," he said. Mary smiled, the expression transforming her face entirely. "Among other things. Come inside, both of you. The desert sun is no friend to pale skin." The interior of the house was cool and inviting, with thick walls that kept out the heat and windows positioned to catch cross breezes. The living room was filled with comfortable furniture arranged around a stone fireplace, and every surface seemed to hold photographs, books, or pieces of handmade pottery. But what caught Marcus's attention was the corner of the room that had been converted into a makeshift office. A modern computer setup sat on a large wooden desk, surrounded by boxes of cassette tapes, manila folders stuffed with papers, and several digital recording devices. It was clearly the work of someone who had collected information systematically but hadn't yet figured out how to organize it effectively. My grandson Daniel set all this up for me last Christmas, Mary said, following Marcus's gaze. He's a good boy, works in computers like you do, but he lives in Denver and doesn't have time to help me figure out how to use it properly. Marcus walked over to examine the setup. It was a good system, probably worth several $1,000s, with professional quality audio equipment and plenty of storage capacity. But he could see immediately that it wasn't being used to its full potential. What exactly are you trying to accomplish? He asked. Mary settled into a chair near the computer, her hands folded over the top of her cane. For the past 5 years, I've been interviewing the elders on our reservation. Many of them are in their 80s and 90s, and they carry stories that will die with them if we don't preserve them properly. She gestured to the boxes of tapes and papers. I have over 200 hours of recordings, plus written notes and photographs. I want to create something that future generations can access easily, something that tells the real story of our people, not the version they teach in textbooks. Marcus felt a familiar stirring of interest, the same feeling he used to get when presented with an interesting technical challenge. Have you thought about how you want to organize everything? By theme, by person, chronologically? All of those ways, Mary said. The stories overlap and connect in ways that aren't always obvious at first. For instance, 3 different people told me versions of the same story about a flood in 1952, but each person remembered different details. I want people to be able to find all the versions and see how memory works, how truth can be layered. Elena had been quietly preparing coffee in the kitchen, and she returned with a tray of steaming mugs and a plate of homemade cookies. Marcus was telling me earlier that his life has fallen apart, she said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. Elena. What? She said innocently. It's not a secret, is it? And Mary's heard worse things than whatever you've done. Mary studied Marcus with renewed interest. What kind of falling apart? Marcus glanced at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. There was something about these women that made confession feel natural, even necessary. I developed a gambling problem, he said. Started small, online poker games after work to unwind. But it escalated until I was betting money I didn't have on things I didn't understand. I lost my savings, my house, my marriage. I hurt people who trusted me. Mary nodded as if this information didn't surprise her. How long? The gambling? About 2 years before it got completely out of control. But I was probably in denial for a year before that. No, Mary said patiently. How long since you've done something that made you proud of yourself? The question caught Marcus off guard. He started to answer, then stopped, realizing he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuinely good about his work or his choices. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe 3 years? I used to build software that helped nonprofits manage their donors and volunteers. But I left that job for something that paid more, and then I left that job for something that paid even more. Somewhere along the way, I stopped caring about whether the work mattered. Mary leaned forward slightly. And what did you tell yourself about why money became more important than meaning? Marcus had been in therapy briefly after his divorce, so he recognized the technique of turning questions back on himself. But, coming from Mary, it didn't feel clinical. It felt like genuine curiosity. I told myself I could always go back to meaningful work later, after I'd made enough to be secure. But enough kept getting bigger, and the lifestyle inflation made it harder to step back down. Ah, Mary said with understanding. You built a prison out of comfort and called it success. The phrase hit Marcus like a physical blow, partly because it was so accurate. He had built a prison, one made of car payments and mortgage obligations and the need to maintain an image that required constant funding. The interesting thing about prisons, Mary continued, is that sometimes the door is unlocked, but you don't realize it because you're so used to the bars. Elena had been listening quietly, and now she spoke up. Tell him about your nephew Joseph, Mary. Mary's expression grew thoughtful. Joseph is my sister's grandson. 5 years ago, he was arrested for selling drugs. Not using them, just selling them to make money to support his family when he couldn't find steady work. He went to prison for 18 months. She paused to sip her coffee. When he got out, he was convinced his life was over. No one would hire him, people crossed the street when they saw him coming, he felt like he was marked forever by his mistakes. What happened to him? Marcus asked. He started volunteering at the community center, helping kids with their homework. Just a few hours a week at first, because he had to do community service anyway. But he discovered he was good at it. Those kids didn't care about his record, they just cared that someone was paying attention to them. Mary smiled. Now he runs the after-school program. He's been clean for 4 years, he's married to a wonderful woman, and he's helping prevent other kids from making the mistakes he made. But none of that could happen until he stopped defining himself by his worst decisions and started making better ones. Marcus felt the story settle into his chest like a seed finding fertile ground. How did he know it was okay to stop running from what he'd done? Someone told him his story wasn't finished yet, Mary said simply. Someone helped him understand that redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about writing a better future. The afternoon stretched on as Mary showed Marcus through her collected materials. The scope of the project was impressive, covering everything from traditional stories and songs to accounts of historical events and changes in reservation life over the decades. But what struck Marcus most was the care with which everything had been preserved, the obvious love and respect Mary had for the voices she was trying to save. This is incredible work, he said, scrolling through some of the digital files that had already been created. Have you thought about making it available online, maybe through a university partnership? Mary's eyes lit up. That's exactly what I was hoping for, but I didn't know how to make it happen. Do you think it's possible? Marcus found himself leaning forward, his mind already racing with possibilities. Not only possible, but important. This is the kind of resource that scholars and tribal members could use for generations. We could build a searchable database, cross-reference themes and speakers, even include maps and timelines to provide context. For the first time in months, Marcus felt excited about a project. Not because of what it might pay or how it might advance his career, but because it mattered. Because it was work worth doing. The thing is, he said, then stopped himself. What? Mary asked. I'm not exactly reliable right now. I mean, I want to help, but I don't have anywhere to live, I'm basically broke, and I'm not sure I trust myself to follow through on commitments. Mary exchanged a look with Elena that Marcus couldn't interpret. Where were you planning to go when you left here? Mary asked. Marcus realized he didn't have an answer. He'd been driving without a destination, running from his problems without running toward anything specific. I don't know, he admitted. Then, why not stay? Mary said. I have a guest room, and this project is going to take months to complete properly. You could help me organize everything, build the database, maybe even conduct some interviews yourself. The offer was so generous and unexpected that Marcus didn't know how to respond. I couldn't impose like that. And I can't pay rent or anything. I'm not asking for rent, Mary said. I'm asking for help with work that matters. Consider it a trade, your skills for a place to stay while you figure out what comes next. Elena smiled. I told you my aunt had a project for someone with computer skills. You also told me she'd been expecting someone to show up, Marcus said. Mary's expression grew serious. I did have a feeling that someone would come soon, someone who needed this work as much as the work needed them. My grandmother always told me to pay attention to those feelings. Marcus looked around the room, at the boxes of irreplaceable stories and the computer system waiting to bring them into the digital age. He thought about Elena's brother who had overcome gambling addiction, and Mary's nephew who had rebuilt his life after prison. He thought about prisons made of comfort and doors that might be unlocked if you just tried the handle. I have to warn you, he said slowly, I might mess this up. I haven't been trustworthy lately. Everyone deserves a chance to become trustworthy again, Mary said. Besides, these stories have waited decades to be properly preserved. They can wait a little longer while you remember who you used to be. As the sun began to set over the mesas, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Marcus had never seen in the city, he felt something shift inside himself. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the possibility of hope. The possibility that his story wasn't finished yet, and that maybe the next chapter could be better than the ones that came before. "Okay," he said, the word coming out quieter than he'd intended. "I'd like to try." Mary smiled, and Elena reached over to squeeze his shoulder. Outside, the desert was settling into evening, and, somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear the sound of wind moving through ancient stone formations, carrying whispers of all the stories yet to be told. 3 months later, Marcus woke before dawn to the sound of desert wind moving through the cottonwood trees outside his window. It had become his favorite sound, replacing the city noise of traffic and sirens that had filled his mornings for years. He dressed quietly and made coffee in Mary's kitchen, then settled at the computer to continue the work that had become his lifeline. The database was taking shape beautifully. What had started as boxes of scattered materials was now an organized, searchable collection of stories that painted a rich picture of Apache life across generations. Marcus had learned to cross-reference themes and speakers, to identify connections between stories told decades apart, to preserve not just the words but the rhythms and pauses that gave them meaning. But, more than that, he had learned to listen. Yesterday's interview had been with Robert Crowfeather, an 86-year-old man who had served in Korea and returned to find his reservation changed by modernization and federal policies he didn't understand. His story of adapting traditional hunting practices to new regulations had taken 2 hours to tell, and Marcus had found himself completely absorbed, forgetting to check the time or worry about technical details. "You're up early," Mary said, entering the kitchen with her usual quiet grace. Despite being 94, she was consistently the second person awake in the household. "Couldn't sleep," Marcus admitted. "I keep thinking about Mr. Crowfeather's story, about how he talked about balance." Mary poured herself coffee and settled at the kitchen table. This had become their morning ritual, coffee and conversation before the day officially began. "What about balance struck you?" Marcus paused in his typing. He said that traditional Apache life was about finding balance between taking what you need and leaving enough for others, between honoring the past and adapting to the present. "But, when I think about my life before, I was completely out of balance. I was taking more than I needed and not leaving anything for anyone else, including my future self." Mary nodded thoughtfully. "And, now?" It was a question she asked often, gently pushing him to examine not just where he'd been but where he was going. Over the months, Marcus had come to appreciate these small challenges to self-reflection. "Now I wake up excited about the work," he said. "I go to bed tired but satisfied instead of anxious. I'm contributing to something that will outlast me." "That's a good foundation," Mary said. "But, what happens when this project is finished?" It was a question Marcus had been avoiding. The database was nearly complete, the website was functional, and they'd already received interest from 2 universities about hosting and maintaining the collection. In another month or 2, his work here would be done. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been so focused on this that I haven't thought much about what comes next." Mary sipped her coffee, watching him with the patient expression he'd learned meant she had something important to say but was waiting for the right moment. "Elena's nephew Daniel called yesterday," she said finally. "The one who lives in Denver and set up this computer system." Marcus looked up from the screen. "Oh?" "He's starting a non-profit organization that helps tribes develop digital archives and online presence. He needs someone with technical skills who understands the cultural sensitivity required for this kind of work." The words hung in the air between them. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, not with anxiety but with recognition. This was what he'd been unconsciously hoping for, a way to continue doing meaningful work without leaving behind everything he'd learned here. "Did you tell him about me?" Marcus asked. Mary smiled. "I told him I knew someone who might be interested. But, I wanted to talk to you first." Marcus saved his work and turned to face Mary fully. 3 months ago, I would have jumped at any job offer without thinking about whether it was right for me. I would have been so focused on the salary and benefits that I wouldn't have considered whether the work aligned with my values. And, now? Now I want to know more about Daniel's vision, about what kind of impact this organization could have, about whether I could do good work there and grow as a person at the same time. Mary's smile widened. That sounds like someone who has learned to ask different questions. The morning interview was with Sarah Begay, a 78-year-old woman who had been one of the first Apache women to attend college in the 1960s. Marcus had been looking forward to her story for weeks, partly because Mary had hinted that Sarah had some interesting perspectives on reinventing yourself. Sarah arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, moving with the brisk energy of someone half her age. She wore traditional turquoise jewelry with modern clothes, her gray hair styled in a way that looked both professional and artistic. When Mary introduced her to Marcus, Sarah studied him with curious, intelligent eyes. Mary tells me you're the young man who's been helping her preserve our stories, Sarah said as they settled in the living room for the interview. I'm trying to, Marcus said, adjusting the recording equipment. Though I feel like I've learned more from the stories than I've contributed to preserving them. Sarah laughed, a sound full of warmth and mischief. That's how it should be. Stories are meant to teach the listener as much as honor the teller. As Marcus started the recording, Sarah began to talk about her childhood on the reservation in the 1950s, about being encouraged by her grandmother to pursue education even when it meant leaving home. But, halfway through the interview, she paused and looked directly at Marcus. Mary told me you're someone who lost his way and found it again, she said. Is that accurate? Marcus glanced at Mary, who nodded encouragingly. He'd grown comfortable discussing his story over the past months, but it still felt vulnerable to share it with someone new. That's one way to put it, he said. I made some bad decisions that cost me my marriage, my home, and my self-respect. I ended up here because I was running away from the consequences. Sarah leaned forward with interest. And what did you find when you stopped running? Work that mattered. People who believed I could be better than my worst mistakes. A chance to contribute to something larger than myself. That's interesting, Sarah said. Because when I was young, I also had to choose between running away from difficulty and running toward possibility. She went on to tell a story Marcus hadn't expected. In 1965, Sarah had been offered a full scholarship to attend graduate school at Stanford University. It was an unprecedented opportunity for a young Apache woman, but it meant leaving her family and community during a time of significant social change. I was terrified, Sarah said. Terrified of failing, terrified of not belonging, terrified of losing my identity in a world that didn't understand where I came from. But, you went anyway? Marcus asked. I went, but not for the reasons you might think. I went because my grandmother told me that sometimes the best way to serve your community is to gain skills and knowledge that you can bring back home. Sarah had earned a master's degree in education, then returned to the reservation to teach for 37 years. She developed curricula that integrated traditional Apache knowledge with modern educational requirements, helping hundreds of children maintain their cultural identity while preparing for opportunities in the broader world. The point, Sarah said, looking directly at Marcus again, is that running towards something difficult because it serves a larger purpose is completely different from running away from something difficult because it's uncomfortable. Marcus felt the words resonate in his chest. How do you know which one you're doing? You ask yourself whether the path you're considering will make you more useful to other people, or just more comfortable for yourself. After Sarah left, Marcus and Mary sat on the porch watching the afternoon light move across the mesas. Marcus had been quiet since the interview ended, processing what he'd heard. She was talking to me, wasn't she? He finally said. About the job opportunity with Daniel. Mary rocked gently in her chair. Sarah has always been good at saying things people need to hear. I'm scared, Marcus admitted. What if I mess up again? What if I can't handle the pressure or the responsibility? Those are good fears, Mary said. They mean you're taking the opportunity seriously. Bad fears would be about things like whether the salary is high enough or whether you'll get proper credit for your work. Marcus thought about his old job, about the nights he'd lain awake calculating bonuses and stock options, about the way he'd measured his worth by his earning potential rather than his contribution to the world. I want to call Daniel, he said. I want to learn more about what he's building. Mary smiled. I hoped you would. The conversation with Daniel Yazzie happened the next morning over video call. Marcus was impressed immediately by the young man's passion and vision. Daniel had worked for major tech companies for 5 years after college, but he'd grown frustrated by the disconnect between the digital tools he was building and the communities that could benefit from them most. Tribes across the country have stories, languages, and knowledge systems that are disappearing, Daniel explained. But they also have young people who are tech-savvy and want to help preserve their culture. What's missing is the bridge between traditional knowledge and digital preservation. Daniel's organization, called Indigenous Digital Heritage, planned to work directly with tribes to develop custom solutions for their specific needs. Some communities wanted to create language learning apps, others needed help digitizing historical documents, still others wanted to build websites that could share their stories with the world while maintaining appropriate cultural protocols. The work Mary described that you've been doing with her is exactly the kind of project we want to support, Daniel said. But, on a larger scale, and with the resources to do it properly. Marcus found himself asking the questions Mary had taught him to prioritize. How would success be measured? What kind of impact were they hoping to have? How would they ensure that the communities they served maintained ownership and control of their cultural materials? Daniel's answers revealed both idealism and practical experience. He'd learned from his corporate work how to build sustainable organizations, but his commitment to serving indigenous communities seemed genuine and well-considered. I'll be honest with you, Marcus said toward the end of the call. I'm interested, but I'm also in recovery from some serious personal and professional mistakes. I need to know that this organization has systems in place to support people who are rebuilding their lives. Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. Can you tell me more about what kind of support you'd need? Marcus appreciated that Daniel didn't dismiss the concern or promise that it wouldn't be an issue. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding the challenge. Accountability, Marcus said. Regular check-ins with someone who understands the difference between normal work stress and the kind of stress that makes people with my history make bad decisions. Clear expectations and honest feedback. And probably some flexibility while I continue working with a therapist. Daniel nodded. Those sound like things any good organization should provide to all its employees, not just people in recovery. And, honestly, given the kind of sensitive cultural work we're doing, having team members who are committed to ongoing personal growth seems like an asset. 2 weeks later, Marcus was packing his few belongings into the same Honda that had brought him to Cedar Ridge, but with a completely different feeling. Instead of running from something, he was driving towards something. Instead of being alone with his failures, he was carrying the support and wisdom of people who had helped him remember who he could be. Mary stood on the porch watching him load his car, her expression mixing pride and sadness in a way that reminded Marcus of his grandmother. Remember, she said as he hugged her goodbye, the stories you've helped preserve here are part of you now. When you encounter challenges in your new work, listen for the wisdom they contain. Elena arrived just as Marcus was starting his car, rolling down the window of her truck to wave goodbye. Don't be a stranger, she called. And, remember, you know where to find us if you ever need to remember who you are. As Marcus drove away from Mary's house, he caught sight of her in his rearview mirror, still standing on the porch, still watching. He thought about the stories he'd learned over the past months, about people who had lost everything and found ways to rebuild, about the difference between running towards something and running from something, about the balance between taking what you need and leaving enough for others. His phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, looking forward to having you on the team. First project starts Monday. Marcus smiled, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about the future. Not because he knew exactly how things would turn out, but because he finally trusted himself to handle whatever came next with integrity and purpose. The road ahead stretched toward Denver and a new chapter of his life, but Marcus no longer felt like he was traveling alone. He carried with him the voices of elders who had shared their wisdom, the support of women who had believed in his capacity for redemption, and, most importantly, a clearer understanding of who he wanted to become. As the mesas of Arizona faded behind him, Marcus found himself already planning how he could incorporate the lessons he'd learned into his new work. He thought about other people who might be running from their mistakes, about the healing power of contributing to something meaningful, about the way stories could teach listeners as much as they honored tellers. The Apache woman had spoken of tomorrow and included him in it. Now it was his turn to help others find their way into the future they were meant to create.